A lone German shepherd puppy limped out of the redwood forest, a frayed leash clenched tightly in his mouth. Behind those steady eyes was a purpose no one expected. What followed wasn't just a rescue, but a revelation. When Ranger Ethan followed him into the mist, he uncovered a truth that would change not only his life, but the meaning of loyalty itself. But why did the puppy choose that moment, and what was hidden deeper in the woods? The forest was still, but not in the way that comforted. It was the kind of stillness that hovered just above the tree canopy, clung to the bark of the redwoods, and sank into the spaces between each heartbeat. Ethan Moore had walked this path 1,000 times. Every bend, every root that jutted out of the soil like an exposed bone, every sudden whisper of wind that stirred the ferns but left the trees untouched. It was supposed to be a routine sweep through a quiet zone of Redwood National Park, a space he loved because it asked for nothing, just gave silence in return. Until that silence was broken not by noise, but by presence. At first it was only movement, something emerging from the shadows ahead, too low to be a bear, too slow to be a deer. Then the shape stepped into the light. A German shepherd puppy no more than 6 months old limped into the center of the forest path with a kind of slow, steady pain that didn't ask for pity. His fur, black and tan, was drenched in old mud and tangled with debris like he had been rolling through the underbrush for days. One ear was nicked and bent slightly at the tip. But none of that held Ethan's attention, not the limp, not the filth, not the matted coat. It was the leash. A red one, frayed and dirty, clenched tightly in the puppy's mouth, like it was a message he had carried for miles. The end was torn, soaked with something dark and dry, possibly mud or something heavier. But the dog held on to it, with a conviction that didn't match his small frame. And then he locked eyes with Ethan. It wasn't fear in that stare. It was insistence. The puppy didn't bark, didn't whine, didn't lower his body in submission or raise his hackles in warning. He simply stood there breathing hard, staring directly at Ethan like he had been looking for him and had finally found him. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward one limp step after another and dropped the leash right at Ethan's boots. Ethan blinked. Years of service had taught him to read intent in body language, human, canine, or otherwise, and every inch of this puppy's stance screamed, "Follow." Ethan crouched slowly, his knees aching under the weight of memory, and reached for the end of the leash. It was rope, not nylon, the kind you find at hardware stores, coarse and unforgiving. The torn edge was coated in damp soil, and Ethan could smell faint traces of something acrid beneath it all. He didn't need to speak, but he did anyway. "What is it, boy?" His voice cracked from disuse. He hadn't spoken aloud all morning, maybe not yesterday either. The puppy didn't answer. Instead, he turned around, limped a few paces back toward the forest, then paused and looked over his shoulder. When Ethan didn't move right away, the puppy returned, picked the leash back up, and gently nudged it against Ethan's shin. That movement, so intentional, so desperate and determined, split something wide open in Ethan's chest. He stood. "Okay," he whispered. "Lead the way." And just like that, the puppy turned and started into the undergrowth, not down a trail, but through a barely there passage, as if following a memory burned into the earth. The path was chaos vines, snagged at Ethan's uniform. Thorns scraped the backs of his hands, and the ground sloped downward into a tangled mess of roots and slick red clay. More than once he stumbled. Once he nearly fell. But the puppy never slowed. Limping, yes. Wincing, maybe. But stopping, never. There was a mission in him. A fire. Ethan kept close behind, breath tightening as the forest grew denser, the sunlight thinner. The scent changed too, from dry bark and pine to something wetter, heavier, tinged with rot. Moss clung to everything. Branches hung low. Time twisted in that thicket made it hard to know if they had walked 5 minutes or 15. And then Ethan slipped. His boot caught on a vine, and he slid sideways into a shallow ditch, catching himself against a root with a grunt. That's when he saw it. A flash of gray fur. Still. Too still. His heart slammed against his ribs as he scrambled through the brambles toward the shape. There, tied to the base of a massive fallen redwood, was another puppy. This one a husky same age as the German shepherd, but nearly lifeless. His fur, once likely white and silver, was soaked through, clumped with sweat and dirt. A piece of twine, thin, cheap, unkind, was looped around his midsection and dug deep into his back leg, swelling the flesh beneath it. His breathing was shallow, so shallow, Ethan had to hold his own breath to see the movement. The shepherd Theo. The name surfaced uninvited and landed like it had always belonged, sat down beside him, tongue-lolling eyes locked onto the husky. Ethan dropped to his knees. The husky's collar glinted under a patch of sunlight. Ethan leaned close. There was a nameplate scratched but readable. And below the name, etched deep in capital letters, "Only one worth saving." He stared at it, not believing, not comprehending. Then, like someone had slapped him in the chest, the truth hit him all at once. This wasn't abandonment. It was judgment. Someone had decided that only one of these puppies deserved a chance. Someone had carved it into metal and tied one dog to a tree in the middle of nowhere, hoping or not caring that he'd be found. And Theo. Theo had torn free or been set free, and instead of running, he came back. "Easy," Ethan whispered, hands trembling as he began working at the knot around the husky's body. "You're gonna be okay." The twine had cut deep, nearly to the muscle. Ethan worked fast, but careful, aware of Theo's eyes on every movement. The shepherd sat so close now that Ethan could feel his breath on his sleeve. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting. For what Ethan didn't know. Permission hope. A miracle. With a grunt, the last loop came free. The husky sagged into Ethan's arms, limp but breathing. His body was frighteningly light. "I've got you," Ethan muttered, wrapping his jacket around the trembling frame. There was no time to hike back for his pack. No way to call for help, no signal this deep. It would be hours before anyone came looking. But Theo had found him once. He'd find the way again. Ethan shifted the husky in his arms, adjusted his grip. "Let's go," he said. Theo stood, favoring one paw. His limp was worse now, his energy fraying, but when Ethan paused, the dog didn't. He pressed forward, brushing Ethan's leg as if to urge him on. Ethan nodded. Together then. The climb back was harder. Mud sucked at their boots, and paws' branches scraped faces, and the weight in Ethan's arms reminded him of every body he'd ever carried out of a battlefield. But this wasn't a battlefield. Not the kind with bullets. This was something older. Something crueler. A test, perhaps? Halfway up the hill, the husky stirred and let out a soft, painful whimper. Theo stopped immediately, ears pricking, body rigid. And then, without hesitation, he barked once, low and steady, not loud, not panicked. Just enough, as if to say, "I'm still here." And the husky quieted. Ethan's throat tightened. He didn't speak the memory that came next, but it filled him anyway, of a desert years ago, of a friend left behind when orders said to keep moving, and of the silence that had followed ever since. But now, in this thick forest, surrounded by moss and shadows and two half-broken lives, silence didn't feel like an option anymore. They broke through the trees together, and sunlight returned like an explosion, bright, hot, blinding. Ethan rushed to the truck, laid the husky across the back seat, wrapped in his jacket, pulse flickering faintly beneath his fingers. Then he turned to Theo. The puppy stood beside the open door, legs, trembling, eyes fixed on his companion. Ethan said, "You coming?" But Theo didn't move. Instead, he circled the truck once, then leapt inside and pressed his body against the husky's side like he had done it before, like it was the only thing that ever made sense. And as Ethan shut the door, started the engine, and turned toward the clinic with tires spitting gravel, he knew this wasn't the end of a patrol. It was the start of something else. Something unspoken. Something sacred. And as the road curved away from the trees, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror just once and caught Theo staring back not at him, but at the world they'd left behind, as if memorizing it just in case they had to return, because somehow it already felt like they would. The sliding doors of the small veterinary clinic hissed open with a soft mechanical sigh, and Ethan stepped into a wash of antiseptic air and muted overhead lights carrying a bundle that was barely breathing. The husky puppy Nico, though the name had not yet been spoken aloud, was still wrapped tightly in Ethan's ranger jacket, his body motionless save for the slight flutter of his side, each breath a thin thread holding him to the world. Beside Ethan walked Theo, limping heavily, but refusing to fall behind his paw, dragging across the linoleum floor with every determined step. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes and a nose ring, looked up from her keyboard and froze. Ethan's voice was low but firm. "Emergency. One's unconscious. The other wouldn't let him die." That was all he had to say. Within seconds, the clinic shifted into motion. A call was made, a gurney appeared, and Dr. Hallie Raymond came bursting through the double doors, her coat already half-buttoned and her hair caught in a tie that had been thrown up in a hurry. She was small, quick-moving, all focus. She reached for the bundle in Ethan's arms, with the same urgency as a soldier disarming a bomb. Her hands, though fast, were impossibly gentle. The moment she peeled back the jacket, her face shifted. "Jesus," she whispered. The husky was a mess of matted fur and tangled limbs. His gums were pale, his breathing ragged, his eyes closed with a kind of finality that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "Fluid in the lungs," Hallie muttered. "Rope burns, possible rib trauma. We need oxygen and a line now." The techs wheeled the gurney through the doors as she moved with them, shouting instructions in medical shorthand Ethan couldn't follow. The husky disappeared through the swinging doors into a corridor of light and white tile. And just like that, Ethan was left standing in the waiting room with only Theo. The shepherd sat beside him, breathing heavily, his coat stiff with dried mud and tension. He didn't cry, didn't pace. He just stared at this door. His friend had vanished through, ears tilted forward as if listening for some invisible thread, something human ears could never detect. There was stillness in him, but not the kind born from fatigue. It was purpose. Ethan watched him, and for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't feel like a ranger or an ex-soldier or even a man who'd spent the last decade dodging his own reflection. He felt like someone standing at the edge of something vast and wordless. Theo hadn't come here to be rescued. He had come here to rescue. And Ethan had merely followed. He sank into the nearest chair, the weight of the husky's limp body still clinging to his arms in memory. His boots left smudges on the clean floor. His hands, when he looked at them, were shaking. Theo didn't move. Not even when Ethan reached into the side pocket of his jacket and pulled out a crushed water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and gently set it down in front of the pup. Only after several long seconds did Theo lower his head, take a few quick mechanical laps, and then sit up again, eyes never leaving the door. Hallie returned nearly 20 minutes later, her gloves off, her hands still damp from a rushed scrub, her face caught between exhaustion and something softer. "He made it through the worst of it," she said, kneeling beside Theo. "Still touch and go, but he's stable for now." Theo didn't react. Not right away. Then his tail moved just once, a slow sweep across the tile. Hallie looked up at Ethan. "Where did you find them?" Ethan leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice low. "Deep in the forest. off any real trail. Husky was tied to a tree near what looked like an old fire pit, almost like someone was testing if they'd be found. Or not. Her brow furrowed. And the shepherd, he came to get me. Ethan swallowed, had the leash in his mouth, dragged it all the way to the road. She blinked. He brought you there? Led me the whole way. Ethan nodded. Wouldn't stop. Wouldn't let me ignore him. Like he knew what he was doing. For a long moment, Hallie just stared at Theo. Then slowly, she reached out her hand. Theo leaned forward and sniffed her fingers. That's not instinct, she murmured. That's choice. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They sat in silence for a while, all three of them. Hallie eventually stood and disappeared again into the exam room. Ethan stayed in the waiting area, and Theo kept his vigil by the door. Whenever a voice echoed faintly from the back hallway, an instruction, a bark, a beeping machine, Theo's ears twitched. Every time a door opened, he shifted forward only to still again when it wasn't Nico. Outside, the sky darkened. The soft patter of coastal rain began to flick against the windows. The world continued to move on. Cars passed, phones rang, shift changes happened, but inside the clinic, time had narrowed to this one dog, waiting for another. Ethan didn't check his watch. He couldn't remember the last time he'd waited for something, without needing a result. When the hours stretched long enough to bend, Ethan finally looked down. Theo had moved closer without Ethan noticing, and was now resting against his boot like it was the safest place on earth. It was strange how fast that happened. Not the bond Ethan didn't have a name for that yet, but the quiet, the comfort. The idea that a dog could sit beside a man who hadn't let anyone in for years and just be there, not asking, not needing, just offering presence. And Ethan felt the shift deep in his chest, like a lock turning. He leaned back in the chair and exhaled, a breath that sounded too much like surrender. When Hallie finally came back, the clock on the wall said something after midnight. Her smile was small, but real. He's holding on, she said. We've got him on fluids and oxygen. He's weak, but that fire's still in there. Ethan nodded. Can I see him? In the morning, she said gently. He needs rest. He looked down at Theo. And him. No major injuries, she replied. A limp, but nothing broken. Soft tissue, probably. He should stay overnight, but honestly, she hesitated. Glancing again at the shepherd, I don't think he'll rest unless he knows the husky's okay. He hasn't taken his eyes off that door, Ethan said. He'll have his chance soon, Hallie promised. But Ethan already knew. This dog wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. So he stretched out on the bench using his jacket as a pillow, and Theo curled up at his feet. Not because he was told to, not because he was commanded, but because that's where he belonged. Ethan didn't sleep much, but when his eyes did close, it was to the sound of Theo's breathing. Slow, steady, present. When morning came, it arrived soft and gray. The sky was still heavy with clouds, and the scent of salt and pine drifted in with the breeze. The glass front of the clinic reflected the two of them, one man, one dog, waiting for something more than just a diagnosis. It was Hallie who opened the door. He's awake, she said. Barely, but he's looking for someone. Theo rose instantly. No hesitation. He followed Hallie through the hallway like he knew every step already. They reached the recovery room. Nico lay inside a heated crate, a blanket tucked around him, wires and tubes framing his fragile body, like scaffolding holding something precious. His eyes were barely open, but when he saw Theo, his ears moved just slightly. Ethan watched from the doorway as Theo padded silently across the tile, stopped at the crate, and sat. He didn't bark, didn't whine. He just looked. and Nico, in his haze of medication and pain, managed to lift his nose to the bars and press it forward. Their noses touched. It was small, barely a second, but Ethan felt it like thunder. Hallie whispered beside him, hand pressed to her chest. "He's fighting harder. I'd bet anything it's because of him." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. He stepped back, giving the moment its space, his boots heavy with mud, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. Through the glass he watched as Theo lifted a paw, still bruised, still stiff, and rested it gently against the metal crate. No sound, no motion, just loyalty. And in that quiet, Ethan understood something he hadn't been able to say aloud since the desert. That there were some bonds you didn't earn. You were chosen for them. And maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to be chosen again. From the corner of the room, his eyes caught a familiar object resting on a tray, coiled, tagged, and still faintly damp. The red leash. He stepped closer, lifted it, sniffed. Gasoline. He looked up slowly, his stomach twisting. The leash wasn't just torn. It had been prepared. This wasn't abandonment. It was an experiment. And Theo had broken the rules. But what Ethan didn't know yet, what he was only just beginning to realize, was that the most important test hadn't been given by the person who tied that leash. It was the one Theo had passed on his own. The test of who he chose to go back for. And that test was still unraveling quietly, powerfully, on the other side of a glass door. The recovery room always smelled like warm gauze and boiled water with a faint undercurrent of antiseptic that never quite faded from the air. The lights were dimmed low during the early morning hours, a courtesy to patients who couldn't complain and to the people who loved them enough to sit and wait through the hours where nothing moved except the machines. Nico's breathing had grown stronger. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't steady, but it was no longer the fragile rasp of a creature hovering between this world and whatever comes after. His ribs lifted with more confidence now, his body no longer sunk into the blankets, but resting on top of them. And though his eyes still fluttered open like broken windows catching wind, there was life in them, unmistakable and searching. And every time those eyes opened, they found Theo. The shepherd never left. It didn't matter if Ethan offered a blanket or coaxed him into the waiting room or gently tried to guide him outside for a break. Theo returned, quiet as breath, persistent as heartbeat. He stayed just outside Nico's crate, back pressed to the wall, eyes fixed on the faint rise and fall of the husky's chest. There was no noise, no whimper, no tail wagging, just presence. The kind that didn't beg to be acknowledged. The kind that simply said, "I'm here." Ethan sat across the room in the same chair he'd used for 3 days now. His back had begun to mold to its curve. The upholstery scratched at the underside of his arms, and the fluorescent ceiling hummed faintly overhead. But none of that mattered anymore. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't waiting alone. He looked at Theo, then at Nico, and something old stirred in his chest. It had taken him a long time to name it. The first night it had felt like obligation, these pups needed him. The second night it had been guilt, he should have found them sooner. But by the third, it had become something different. Something softer. Something deeper. It was a memory. Not a sharp one like a blade, but the kind that came wrapped in smell and light and sound. Major. The name fell into Ethan's thoughts without effort, and he almost flinched when it did. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years, hadn't dared to. Major was a military K9 black coat, like oil eyes, like cut glass. Assigned to their unit when Ethan was still new to sand, new to heat, new to the idea that trust could wear 4 legs and answer to whistles. Major had taken a blast meant for the squad. No hesitation. No warning bark. Just action. And when the smoke cleared, Ethan had been on the ground screaming his name, blood on his hands, sand in his teeth, and the only answer he got was silence. Ethan had never said goodbye. He hadn't even stayed for the burial. Instead, he'd come back home, quit everything, and buried himself in the quiet of Redwood. Until now. Until Theo. Until a German Shepherd puppy half covered in mud decided to walk back into the fire not to survive, but to bring someone out with him. Ethan stood back, cracking as he stretched. He needed coffee, or maybe sleep. But when he turned toward the hallway, a small clink of metal stopped him. He looked back. Theo was no longer at the foot of the crate. He was pawing at the latch. Ethan blinked. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't even desperate. Theo's movement was measured, deliberate, his teeth catching the thin edge of the sliding bolt, his paw pressing gently against the base. The latch clicked open. The crate door swung half an inch. Theo nudged it the rest of the way. Ethan didn't move. Couldn't. Theo stepped inside. He moved carefully, gently, as though he understood the fragility of every inch of that space. He lowered himself next to Nico, curled his body around the huskies like a second blanket, and rested his head beside the others. Nico stirred. One ear lifted. And then, as if the pain no longer mattered, Nico leaned into him. There were no words for it. No commands, no training logs, no good boy praise. Because this wasn't learned. This was chosen. And watching it, witnessing it, did something permanent to Ethan. He took a step forward, quiet, reverent, and crouched near the open door of the crate. Theo looked up for just a second, then laid his head back down. "You're not in the way that look seemed to say. You're part of this too." Ethan breathed out slowly, something breaking open and flooding through him like warm light through stained glass. Maybe it had started the moment that Leash dropped at his boot. Maybe it started in the mud or on the clinic floor. Or when Nico pressed his nose to the crate bars. Or maybe it started a long time ago when a different shepherd had given his life to protect Ethan's, and he had run from the weight of it ever since. Now, here he was. 3 lives in one room, each carrying scars they didn't speak of. Each choosing to stay. Hallie walked in sometime later with a chart in hand and froze. She smiled. "I'm not separating them again," she whispered. Ethan didn't argue. He sat beside the crate, legs folded, arms resting on his knees. Theo's tail thumped once. Nico, now asleep again, had tucked his head under Theo's chin. Ethan leaned back against the wall and let himself exist in that silence. Not as a soldier, not as a ranger, not even as the man who'd carried them both out of the woods, but as someone being healed from the inside out, one heartbeat at a time. Later that afternoon, he stepped outside to call the ranger station, giving Hallie time to check vitals and rotate IVs. The air smelled of wet bark and early spring. Rain clouds had moved on, leaving the pavement slick and shining in soft sunlight. He didn't speak much on the call, just updated records, requested a few days off, and promised to return with something worth explaining. No questions were asked, no explanations offered. Redwood had taught its people to trust the forest and the silence it wrapped around those who needed time. When he returned inside, Hallie was waiting with a file folder. "Got their intake papers started," she said. "I put them both under your name. You can change it later if you want." Ethan didn't look at the forms, just nodded. He wasn't going to change it. That evening, while Nico slept and Theo kept watch, Ethan wandered into the clinic's small break room and found an old kettle and a canister of instant coffee. He boiled water, poured a cup, and stepped outside again, this time onto the back deck that overlooked a narrow strip of trees. The sun was low now, caught between the limbs like gold trapped in amber. He sipped slowly. Behind him, through the window, he could see the crate, see the 2 bodies pressed together in quiet rhythm. He'd seen comrades lean on each other like that after bomb blasts, seen soldiers sit back to back in foxholes, sharing warmth, sharing silence. But he'd never seen anything like what Theo and Nico shared. It wasn't camaraderie, it was devotion. It was something closer to love. And the part that stunned Ethan most wasn't just that they had chosen each other. It was that now somehow they were choosing him. As he walked back inside, coffee cooling in his hand, he paused in front of the crate again. Theo lifted his head. Just once. Ethan crouched and reached through the bars. Theo didn't pull away. Nico's stirred eyes half opening and nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. Soft, trusting. And Ethan felt it all at once that he was no longer on the outside of something beautiful. He was in it now. Whatever this was, whatever name it took, Pack Family Redemption, it had room for him. He stayed there, kneeling hand, resting on warm fur long after the sky turned dark. And he didn't notice how easily he started breathing again. How full the air felt. How quiet had become comfort instead of punishment. The next morning, as Hallie opened the doors and let in the light, she found Ethan asleep on the floor, his head against the crate, one hand still resting inside. Theo was awake watching her. Nico, still weak but steady, blinked slowly and leaned into Ethan's arm, and Hallie smiled, not saying a word. Because some things didn't need explaining. Some things just were. And as the sun spilled across the floor and the world shifted 1 degree closer to spring, Ethan stirred and opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Theo. The second, Nico. And in that moment, with the warmth of 2 fragile, faithful lives pressed into the space he'd once kept locked so tightly shut, Ethan felt something break loose inside him. Not something painful. Something new. Something real. And without meaning to, he whispered, "Maybe I needed saving too." Theo's tail moved just once. Nico's paw stretched out and touched Ethan's boot. And from the hallway came the sound of Hallie's voice, soft but steady. "Come on, boys. It's time for your first walk." But neither pup moved yet. Not until Ethan stood first. The wind carried the scent of earth and wildflowers. A tender breeze that curled through the open clearing behind the veterinary clinic like it too was searching for something gentle. The grass hadn't yet been mowed for spring, and patches of clover stretched wide like tiny islands in a soft green sea. Morning light spilled across the meadow in warm streaks, and above it all, the sky was a wide-open canvas, blue boundless kind. And in the middle of that quiet openness, a husky puppy took his first step without help. Nico moved with hesitation, at first his legs still unsure, his paws sinking ever so slightly into the soft ground. But there was something undeniable in the way his chest lifted, in the way his ears angled forward, in the way his gaze flicked up to the shepherd standing a few feet ahead of him. Theo didn't move. He stood still, watching his friend, his tail low, but steady, body alert, but patient. Ethan stood off to the side, arms folded across his chest, boots damp from morning dew. He didn't speak, didn't encourage, didn't whistle. He knew this moment wasn't his to direct. It was Nico's. And with a small exhale like a breath he'd been holding for days, the husky began to move. One paw, then another, and another. He limped slightly. The left hind leg still carried stiffness from trauma, and the muscle hadn't fully returned. But it didn't stop him. Each step grew more certain, more insistent. A rhythm emerged, a cadence. And then, like it had been there all along, momentum. Nico ran. He didn't run fast. He didn't run far. But it was running. His legs extended, ears flopped, tongue spilled out to the side like a flag in the wind. His stride was uneven, awkward, but wholly beautiful. It was the kind of movement that didn't ask for perfection. It asked for permission. Permission to feel free. Ethan's throat tightened. The sound caught somewhere between a gasp and a laugh. He could feel the pressure behind his eyes building his heart, knocking against old armor that had once felt so permanent. But nothing was permanent anymore. Not the silence. Not the pain. Not even the guilt. Especially not the guilt. Nico stumbled halfway across the clearing, his front paw catching on a tuft of grass, and tumbled sideways into a patch of clover. For a moment he lay still, chest-heaving eyes closed. Then slowly, a grin spread across his face. A real one. A foolish, toothy puppy grin. And Theo. Theo trotted over, not to lead, not to bark, not to correct. He stood beside Nico, nose lowered, tail wagging just once. Just once. That single tail wag held something deeper than language. It wasn't celebration or amusement, it was affirmation. A quiet, powerful acknowledgement. You did it. You stood. You ran. You chose the wind. Ethan walked across the field slower than usual, as if each step needed reverence. When he reached them, he crouched. Nico rolled over lazily, his belly exposed paws limp and twitching. Theo leaned his shoulder into Ethan's knee, warm and present. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something he hadn't touched in years. A photograph. Its edges were curled with time corners, dulled by years of being pushed deeper into the bottom of a drawer no one opened. The color had faded a little, but the moment it captured was still as sharp as the day it was taken. Ethan, in uniform. Desert behind him, endless and harsh. And beside him, Major. The shepherd was larger, older, a different kind of strength than Theo, but the eyes were similar. Sharp, watchful, loyal. Ethan had never let himself hold that photo for long. It always came with too much weight, a memory of heat and screaming of smoke in his lungs of red sand staining fur. But now, sitting in a field full of new breath, of second chances, of wildflower-scented air and clumsy paws, Ethan felt something shift inside him. He held the photo in one hand, his other resting on Theo's head. His name was Major, he whispered. The words came slowly, like they'd forgotten the shape of his mouth. I never said it again. Not even once. 7 years, and I couldn't say it. Theo didn't react. Not exactly. But he looked up at Ethan, and in those amber eyes there was a stillness that wrapped around the moment like a blanket. Not sympathy, not sadness, just knowing. And Nico, the husky, rolled back over and nudged his nose into Ethan's hand, bumping the photograph slightly like he too was part of this now. Which he was. They both were. Ethan sat there for a long time, the photo balanced between memory and presence, between the dog he had lost and the ones who had found him. There was something sacred about it. The sunlight painting the field gold, the soft thrum of a new day in the air. The way Theo sat steady like a sentinel while Nico laid stretched in a clover bed, as if he had always belonged there. You two are trouble, Ethan said, but there was no edge in his voice, only warmth, only awe. They began walking back toward the clinic slowly, with Nico wobbling slightly on each step, and Theo staying beside him, matching his pace. Ethan stayed a few steps behind, watching them move together, and with every uneven stride and every shared glance between them, he felt like he was watching something ancient and true. Loyalty that wasn't taught. Love that wasn't earned. Just chosen. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Ethan paused and turned back, taking one last look at the field bathed in light, the clover patch where Nico had fallen, the place where a run had become a revelation. He didn't want to forget it. So he pulled out his phone, snapped a photo, not posed, not planned. Just the three of them, 2 dogs, 1 man, the space between them filled with something unnamed. Later after dinner, canned soup for Ethan, boiled chicken for the boys. They settled in the small corner of the clinic, where they'd made their unofficial home. Theo curled at Ethan's feet, his breathing slow, steady, his ear flicking whenever Nico shifted beside him. Nico, though still weak, was leaning less, sleeping deeper. trusting more. Ethan sat on the floor back against the wall, photo of Major resting on his knee. "I was supposed to look after him," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I got distracted. Just for a second. A sound, a shift in the dunes. I looked away, and that was enough." Theo's head lifted. Ethan didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on the photo. "I told myself I couldn't do it again. Couldn't get close, couldn't carry that kind of loss." He reached down, let his fingers drift through Theo's fur. "But you made it impossible to stay that way. You came out of the trees like you knew exactly where to go. Exactly who to find." There was no answer. There didn't need to be. Nico stretched in his sleep, his paw resting on Ethan's shin. And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel haunted by memory. He felt grounded in presence. He closed his eyes and let the quiet settle over them. Not the heavy quiet of loneliness, the full kind. The kind that comes when nothing needs to be said, because everything is understood. When he opened his eyes again, the room was dark, except for the faint glow of the moon leaking through the blinds. Theo was asleep now, but his body was still pressed close to Nico's, their backs touching like an unspoken promise. Ethan rose slowly, legs stiff, and walked toward the front of the clinic. On the receptionist's desk, the photo he had taken earlier still glowed faintly on the screen of his phone. He looked at it, really looked. 2 puppies side by side in a golden field. One scarred, one limping. Both whole in ways words couldn't explain. He sent it to himself, labeled the file "First Run," and before heading back to the recovery room, he whispered into the dark, not expecting an answer, not needing one. "Thank you, Major." Not because he was finally ready to forgive himself, but because he was finally ready to remember. The field would still be there tomorrow, and so would the 2 who had chosen to walk beside him. Together they weren't just healing, they were becoming. The forest behind Ethan's cabin wasn't large, but it was quiet, dense, and wild enough to carry secrets. Trees rose tall like ancient sentinels, branches brushing the sky, bark thick with years. The undergrowth was soft and forgiving beneath boots and paws alike. And the morning fog always lingered a little longer than it needed to, as if reluctant to leave. It was the perfect place to test instinct, focus, and heart. And that's exactly what Ethan had in mind. Theo stood at the edge of the tree line, ears forward, nose twitching slightly as the first command drifted into the air. "Find it," Ethan said softly. There was no dramatic pause, no second guessing. Theo shot forward like a drawn arrow loosed from the string, not with speed alone, but with precision. His nose skimmed just above the soil. Body low, tail straight like a compass needle locked on true north. Every turn was deliberate. Every movement refined by something that didn't come from training, but from inside. Ethan didn't move, just watched. He had planted the scent, a rag soaked in human sweat, about 15 minutes earlier, hidden beneath a pile of pine needles at the base of a fallen log, half a football field into the trees. No dog had ever made the find in under 5 minutes. Theo found it in 2. The shepherd's body froze near the log head, dipping nose pressing into the leaves. Then gently he picked up the rag and trotted back, tail lifting slightly. Ethan crouched, held out his hand. Theo dropped it into his palm with care, then sat, chest rising and falling with contained energy, waiting for the next challenge. Ethan stared at the rag, then at the dog. "Damn," he whispered. There was something in Theo's eyes, a sharpness, a steadiness, something that reminded him of military precision without any of the brutality. It was instinct, yes, but it was also choice. This dog wanted the work, needed it. Ethan turned and caught movement in the trees. Nico. The husky wasn't fast, not yet. His legs still trembled sometimes, and his stride had a noticeable drag in the back right paw. But he was following. Always a few steps behind Theo, but never too far. And always watching. Intently. He had seen Theo pick up the rag, seen how Ethan praised him, seen the return. And now Nico stood on the edge of the clearing, eyes glowing like fire behind glass. Ethan knelt. You wanted Nico didn't bark, just limped forward. Ethan smiled. Okay then, let's see what you've got. The training wasn't about speed for Nico. It couldn't be. His body wasn't ready. But that didn't mean he lacked ability. When Ethan laid a scent trail across the grass, weaving it between fallen branches and moss-covered rocks, Nico followed. Slowly. Carefully. With pauses and hesitations, but never giving up. And when he found the rag 30 yards in beneath a stack of wet leaves, he didn't bark or howl or run. He simply sat beside it and waited, like he knew someone would come. Ethan walked to him and knelt rubbing behind the husky's ears. You stayed with it, he murmured, and Nico leaned into the touch. Theo, standing a few feet away, gave a short huff, almost approval. The next day the course was harder, longer trail, more distractions. Ethan hid a second scent, an old jacket from a friend who'd stayed the night months ago, and buried it beneath an overturned log halfway up a ridge near the edge of the forest. Theo was off like a missile again, weaving between trees, bounding over roots, nose pressed low to the earth. He ignored birds, ignored a rabbit that darted across his path, ignored the world, except for the scent. 4 minutes. That was all he needed. When he returned, mud splattered across his paws and chest. He carried the jacket like it was treasure. Nico watched from the porch. This time he didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped down into the grass, limping, but determined, and made his way toward the trail. Ethan didn't stop him. He watched the husky disappear into the trees, slower than Theo, more cautious. But he didn't turn back. He followed the exact path Theo had carved out, nose-twitching tail, swaying gently. It took him nearly 20 minutes. But when he came back, dragging the corner of the jacket between his teeth, Ethan could barely hold the emotion in his chest. You don't quit, do you? He said, crouching low. Nico dropped the jacket and wagged his tail. Just once. That evening, the three of them sat on the back porch, the last of the sunset bleeding into the horizon, golden light catching in the glass of Ethan's coffee cup. Theo lay on one side, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Nico curled up near Ethan's feet, his breathing calm ears twitching at every distant sound. You two, Ethan said softly. You're different. Not because they had survived. Not even because they had chosen each other, but because they were rising, becoming. Not just pets, not just rescues, but something closer to what Ethan once thought he'd left behind, partners. The kind that moved with you through the worst. The kind that didn't flinch when the wind changed. The kind that stayed. The following morning, Ethan set up a more complex track. 2 scent trails, one real one, false. He buried old gloves and laid a decoy trail with fresh socks soaked in another human scent, just to test discernment. Theo didn't even hesitate. He ignored the socks, beeline to the glove, and returned with his usual composure. Calm, focused. Ethan barely had time to praise him before Nico stepped forward, eyes locked, body ready. This time, Ethan gave no command. Nico chose to go. And when he did, he followed Theo's exact pattern, but then near the turn, he paused, sniffed, turned away from the decoy, doubled back, and found the glove. Ethan didn't move for a long moment. Then he sat down right there in the grass and laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was staggering. These weren't just dogs who'd been abandoned. They were creatures carved by something deeper than pain. They were born to save. Later that night, after dinner and water and long stretches of silent companionship, Ethan pulled out a canvas bag from the back of his closet. He hadn't opened it in 7 years. Inside was Major's harness. The patch was worn. Search and rescue faded to near invisibility, but the fabric still held the shape of a working dog's life. The smells, the stains, the marks of service. He placed it on the floor and knelt beside Theo. The shepherd sniffed it, sat, didn't flinch, didn't look away, just met Ethan's eyes. "You've already earned this," Ethan whispered. Then he looked at Nico. The husky watched from the doorway, tail sweeping across the floor slowly. "Maybe you have too," Ethan said. They weren't fast, they weren't perfect, but they were steady. They were willing. And above all, they chose each other. Every day, every test, every breath. By the end of the week, Ethan had set up a full test trail complete with a simulated call scent marker and recovery point. Theo aced it. Nico took longer, but he didn't fail. Not once. He stopped, rested, recalibrated, but always kept going. Always finished. Ethan knew then. This wasn't just recovery. It was transformation. And not just for them. For him too. He was no longer just someone who'd watched a dog die and decided to disappear into trees. He was someone standing beside two lives who refused to disappear, who pushed forward into the world, not to escape, but to help, to heal, to serve. And somewhere deep in the muscle of the moment, Ethan realized this was in their blood. Not something taught, something known. The blood of those who save. And as the moon lifted over redwood, casting silver light across the grass, Ethan stood in the clearing, hands in his pockets, and watched the two pups lie down beside each other in the dirt, tired, content, and whole. They had chosen the hard path. And because of them, so had he. The forest felt different that day. Still familiar. Still wrapped in its green hush, but there was a subtle weight in the air. Not a storm, not a threat. Just presence. The kind of presence that made you pay attention. That made you move with care, breathe slower. Feel the bark under your hand and the earth beneath your feet as something alive, not passive. Ethan Moore had spent years walking these woods. But this time he wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. The spring inspection had become routine over the years. After every rain cycle, he walked the back trails of redwood to check for landslides, weakened limbs, or erosion. With Theo and Nico in tow, the rhythm was different now. More cautious, more deliberate, but far more meaningful. He wasn't just checking trails anymore. He was teaching them, trusting them, relying on them. Theo led the way with the calm confidence he had earned through instinct and days of tracking drills. His stride was steady, his ears alert, nose twitching at every shift in the wind. He didn't rush. He didn't wander. He just moved like he understood the path better than anyone born to two legs ever could. Nico walked a few paces behind Ethan, still regaining strength, but more determined than ever. He didn't complain. He didn't try to match Theo's speed. He simply stayed close, glancing up every so often, eyes bright, as if checking whether Ethan still had the trail, or whether the trail still had Ethan. The morning sun filtered through the trees in thin gold sheets, slicing the forest floor into patches of warmth and shadow. Ferns rustled as a deer darted quietly deeper into the brush, and birdsong trickled down from the high canopy like soft bells in the wind. For a while all was peace. Then the peace shattered. It began as a creak, low, subtle, distant. Ethan paused mid-step. His foot hovered just above a patch of moss. The sound came again, a groan long and splintered from above. Theo froze, ears jerking forward. Ethan turned his head just in time to hear the crack. A branch, massive, heavy deadwood fat with winter rot, snapped from the high limb of a redwood tree. It fell with terrifying speed, air rushing around it like a scream. Ethan didn't move. There wasn't time. But Nico did. The husky launched forward with everything he had. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't clean. His body twisted mid-leap, paws skidding across the mud and then impact. He slammed into Ethan's side with the force of a thrown boulder. Ethan stumbled backward, caught off balance, and crashed into the ferns, shoulder scraping against bark elbow, slamming into the forest floor. The branch hit where he had stood not 2 seconds earlier. It split across a flat stone with a sound like a gunshot bark and splinters exploding into the air. Debris scattered across the trail. Silence followed, thick and absolute. Ethan's breath punched out of him. For a second, he couldn't feel anything but the ache in his ribs and the ringing in his ears. Then, he rolled over. Nico. The husky lay just feet away, legs stretched awkwardly, one paw pinned beneath the smaller end of the broken limb. He whimpered once, high and thin. Ethan crawled to him, heart-pounding, hands shaking. He lifted the branch carefully, pushed it off, and ran his fingers over the leg. No break, no gushing wound, but swelling already beginning to bloom beneath the fur. Theo was there instantly, hovering his body close but not panicked. His nose pressed to Nico's flank, then to Ethan's shoulder. "I'm okay," Ethan whispered, though his voice cracked under the weight of it all. "I'm okay." But that wasn't the truth. Because in that moment, something inside Ethan broke, not with pain, but with clarity. This wasn't just a dog. This wasn't just an act of protection. Nico had saved him. And not just from the branch, from silence, from stillness, from the hollow space he had been living in for years, pretending that peace was just the absence of noise, that healing was just time passing, that not dying meant you had truly survived. Ethan knelt beside Nico and pressed his forehead to the husky's. "You were supposed to stay back," he whispered, voice tight. "You weren't supposed to run in." Nico licked his chin gently, and Ethan laughed through a tear he didn't wipe away. Because in that moment, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to believe. He wasn't the one doing the rescuing anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. He was being rescued, every day, by a shepherd who walked back into the forest instead of running free, by a husky who still bore the weight of old wounds but leapt anyway, by the loyalty they gave without hesitation. And in the heart of that forest, on a trail slick with mud and memory, Ethan finally let himself feel it. Not just the fear of almost losing them, but the overwhelming, aching love of having them at all. He carried Nico back the rest of the way, gently, carefully, the husky's head tucked into the curve of his arm. Theo walked close, his flank brushing Ethan's leg, with every step a silent escort, a steady presence. Back at the cabin, Ethan cleaned the leg, wrapped it in soft gauze, and laid Nico down beside the wood stove. He lit a fire, let the warmth build, then sat beside them, knees bent, hand resting on Nico's head. The pup was tired, but not in pain. His breathing was even, eyes half closed in the flickering firelight. Theo curled beside him, his body curved around the husky's like a protective shell. Ethan leaned back against the wall and stared at the flames. For years he had told himself that pulling away was safety, that closing doors was survival, that keeping his world small meant nothing could break it again. But then came Theo with a frayed leash in his mouth and a look that said, "Trust me." Then came Nico with a body full of bruises and a spirit that still burned. And now Ethan, who once believed his role was to stay quiet, to stay useful, to stay alone, had been pushed out of the path of something deadly by a dog who refused to let him fall, who decided without question that Ethan was worth saving. He didn't know what kind of person that made him yet. but he knew what kind of person it didn't. He was no longer the man who let go and kept walking. He was the one who stayed, the one who listened, the one who knelt on muddy ground and whispered, "I've got you not just to the dogs, but to himself." That night, after the fire had dimmed to a slow orange glow, Ethan stood in the dark and looked at the two pups asleep beside each other. Nico's bandaged paw was stretched toward Theo, who had tucked his head close as if still standing guard in his sleep. Ethan walked to the kitchen, pulled open a drawer, and reached for something he hadn't touched in years. A folded piece of paper tucked beneath receipts and junk mail. It was a deployment roster. Faded, stained. Major's name was still on it. So was Ethan's. And for the first time in 7 years, Ethan didn't fold it back in shame. He laid it gently on the table and placed 2 photos beside it, one of Major and the one he had taken days ago in the clearing, the first time Nico ran, the first time Theo watched with pride. Different dogs, different years, but the same story. One of devotion, one of choice, one of returning over and over, not for duty, but for love. He looked at the table, then at the door leading to the bedroom where the 2 pups now slept in a pile of shared breath and quiet loyalty. And he whispered not to the room, not to the night, but to the truth that now lived inside his bones. "I thought I came here to save you, but the one who was saved was me." In the silence that followed, there was peace. Not the kind born from solitude. The kind born from being seen, chosen, loved, and in the glow of that firelight with Nico safe and Theo watching, Ethan knew he would never walk alone again. The call came just as the last light slipped beneath the tree line, swallowed by a fog that rose thick and fast through the lower trails. The dispatcher's voice crackled with static, but urgency rang clear. "Family of 3. Off trail near Fern Creek. No GPS, no signal, just a ridge cam ping before they vanished." Ethan didn't hesitate. He clipped on his field jacket, grabbed the emergency satchel, and opened the back door of the cabin. Theo was already standing at the threshold, body alert, ears forward. Nico stood just behind him, tail low but wagging paw still wrapped from the old injury eyes, asking no questions, just waiting. "We've got work," Ethan said simply. And like that, the team moved. The fog outside wrapped around them like breath, made visible swirling in thick coils that blurred every edge of the world. The trail to Fern Creek was one Ethan knew by heart, but in this mist, even familiar turns felt foreign. Trees bent toward them like watchers, their limbs disappearing into the gray. The silence was complete. No birdsong, no breeze, just the muffled sound of boots, paws, and the steady inhale-exhale of 3 lives moving as one. They reached the split in the trail, the place where hikers often mistakenly veered toward an old washout, and that's when Theo froze. His body stiffened, nose tilting upward, chest expanding. Ethan stopped. "What do you smell, boy?" Theo didn't answer with a bark. He didn't have to. His feet were already moving, sliding into the brush-off trail, head low, tail steady. The leash hung loose from Ethan's grip, but he didn't try to rein the shepherd in. Theo had found the scent, and he was following it. Ethan adjusted his shoulder pack and nodded to Nico. "Let's go." The descent into the forest beyond Fern Creek was steep and slick with moisture. The fog grew denser, curling around their legs, creeping up their arms, swallowing every flashlight beam before it reached the ground. It was like walking through breath, through memory, through dream. Theo moved with certainty, his pace unwavering. His nose darted from rock to branch to moss-covered log. Occasionally he paused, listening, sniffing, recalibrating, and then moved again. Ethan felt the rhythm shift around him, his own breath syncing with the dog's steps, falling into place, with the silent urgency of something sacred. Then after 15 minutes, that felt like an hour, Theo stopped. He didn't sit, didn't bark. He simply stood body taut, gaze locked ahead into the fog. Ethan approached quietly, squinting. And then he saw them. 3 forms huddled beneath a large rock outcropping, half hidden, soaked to the bone, unmoving. The father sat slumped against the stone, one hand cradling his ankle. His daughter, maybe 10, was curled into his side in a rain-soaked jacket. And behind them stood a small boy flashlight clutched in one trembling hand, its beam flickering weakly through the fog. Theo took 1 step forward, then stopped. His tail didn't wag. His posture didn't drop. He simply watched them, guarded, protective, not just alerting, but assessing like a sentry, evaluating threat, vulnerability, need. Ethan stepped forward, kneeling. "Hey there," he called gently. "You're safe now. My name's Ethan. These are my boys." The little girl looked up slowly, lips pale, eyes wide with exhaustion. She didn't speak, but the flashlight dropped from the boy's hand, and that was when Nico moved. He stepped out of the mist like something conjured, fur, glistening eyes, soft breath, steady. His steps weren't fast. His limp was still there. But it didn't matter. He went straight to the little boy. No detour, no hesitation. And when he reached him, he nudged his nose softly into the child's chest. The boy dropped to his knees and wrapped both arms around the husky. No sound. Just that hold. Like he'd found an anchor in the middle of the storm. Theo moved, then circling the father and daughter, tails steady, body angled toward the trees behind them. Watching. Waiting. Shielding. Ethan knelt beside the father. "Can you move?" Ankle, the man said through clenched teeth. Twisted, maybe fractured. "Help's coming," Ethan replied. "But you're okay. You're found." He reached for his radio and called it in. Found them, 3 individuals, adult male with ankle injury, 2 children cold, but safe. Coordinates pinging now, standing by. The voice on the other end cracked. "Copy that, Ethan. Good work. We're 10 out." Ethan looked at the 2 dogs. Theo now stood beside the little girl, allowing her to lean into his side. His coat was soaked, but he didn't flinch. He didn't shift. He simply stood there like a heartbeat wrapped in fur, keeping her grounded. Nico had curled around the little boy's side, letting the child bury his fingers into thick neck fur, his sobs muffled by the weight of safety. Ethan sat down next to them and exhaled. He didn't speak again for a long time. He didn't need to, because what mattered was happening without words. It was in the steadiness of Theo's stance, in the warmth of Nico's breath, in the way the children's hands clung to them like they were lifelines, not animals. And maybe they were. Because in the deepest part of that fog, in the silence of the woods, in the half-moon glow, trapped in mist, something ancient stirred. Something that felt like a promise, made not with speech, but with breath, with presence, with the refusal to leave someone behind. When the rescue team arrived, the lights broke through the mist like stars piercing storm clouds. EMTs rushed forward, blankets unfolded, voices rose in efficient calm. But no one moved from the dogs, not right away. The girl whispered something to Theo. The boy kissed Nico's ear and didn't let go. And every responder there, every medic, every ranger, every trained professional stood still for just a second, watching 2 muddy, tired dogs cradle a family back into hope. They didn't just find them. They held them. And Ethan? He looked at Theo, at Nico, and something bloomed in his chest that wasn't pride. It was something more fragile, more eternal. Love, yes, but also awe. Because he hadn't taught them to do this. No one had. They had chosen it, just like they had chosen him. Later, as the medics escorted the family toward the transport, the father turned to Ethan. "Where did you find dogs like that?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at Theo standing tall beside the girl until the last possible second. He looked at Nico, who limped behind the boy, never once looking at his own injury. And then softly he said, "They found each other." The man blinked. And then they found me. That night back at the cabin, Ethan didn't light a fire. He didn't need to. The warmth in the room came from two curled bodies on the rug, Theo snoring softly. Nico's paw resting gently against his friend's flank. Ethan sat beside them and placed his hand on both. His breath matched theirs. Inhale, exhale, inhale. 3 rhythms, 3 lives, a symphony of breath in the silence of the night. And Ethan realized the darkness would always come. The fog would always return. But as long as these hearts beat together, no one would ever be truly lost again. It began with a photograph. Someone on the rescue team had taken it. No one knew exactly who. It wasn't posed, wasn't curated, just a candid snap in the middle of that fog-thick night. But it held something that words couldn't explain. A little girl wrapped in a rescue blanket, her tiny fingers curled deep into the dark coat of a German shepherd, standing like a statue beside her. And next to them, a young boy half asleep against the warm body of a husky with soft eyes and a bandaged paw. The caption read, "2 dogs, 2 children, 1 miracle in the fog." By morning it had gone viral. Local news stations picked it up first. Then regional outlets. Then a national segment, 3 minutes of video from the ranger station, the trail camera footage stitched with photos from that night. Headlines used words like heroes, lifesavers, K9 guardians. People flooded the Redwood Park page with questions. Donations came in messages poured through. But through it all, Ethan stayed quiet. He didn't need the attention. Neither did the dogs. What mattered wasn't the recognition. What mattered was that something had shifted in the hearts of strangers, and it had begun with Theo and Nico. At the ranger station that week, Ethan stood beside Chief Grant in the front courtyard. The old stone building cast long shadows across the lawn, and a small group of staff and local press stood gathered in a respectful arc. A light breeze carried the smell of pine and early summer, and sunlight fell in golden threads through the canopy overhead. Theo and Nico stood by Ethan's side, freshly bathed, but still proudly scruffed their badges, polished and waiting. Chief Grant cleared his throat and stepped forward. "I've worked this forest for 33 years, he began, voice low and even. "And I've seen storms, fires, rescues that came just in time and some that didn't. I've seen teams give everything they have. But I've never seen anything quite like this." He turned to Ethan. "You said it best. They didn't just find the missing. They held them. They kept them steady." Grant stepped toward the shepherd first. He crouched slightly, something rare from a man known for never bending, and clipped a leather badge to Theo's custom-fit harness. The tag read, "Official Rescue Companion. Redwood Park Trail Response." Theo didn't move. His eyes remained locked on Ethan. Then Grant moved to Nico. The husky's tail thumped softly as the badge was placed on his vest. His breathing was calm, his ears tilted back slightly, not in fear, but in something gentler. Understanding? When Grant stood again, he looked not at the crowd, but at Ethan. "They're part of us now," he said simply. Ethan couldn't speak at first, not because the words weren't there, but because something fuller had taken their place. He looked at Theo, at Nico, and for the first time since he'd walked out of that final deployment, since the day he threw his pack into the back of a rusted truck and drove north until the road stopped mattering, he felt like he belonged somewhere again. Not as a ranger, not even as a rescuer, as a person, as a man who had stopped hiding, because he had been found. Later that afternoon, the courtyard cleared. Staff returned to their stations. Reporters packed their cameras. Grant clapped Ethan on the shoulder and said, "There's a meeting next week if you want to help draft the new K9 trail support protocols." Ethan only nodded. He'd be there. Not because it was expected, but because he wanted to be. He walked the boys home slowly that day, down the winding trail to the cabin. The trees whispered gently overhead, and the sun flickered through branches like it was trying to keep up with the rhythm of their steps. Theo trotted slightly ahead tail level every few strides, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Nico was still close. Nico, though still slower, had regained a steadiness in his stride, his paw barely dragging now, his body balanced and firm. When they reached the clearing, Ethan paused. He turned and looked at the forest behind them, the one that had once felt like exile. It didn't anymore. It felt like home. That night, he made stew. A proper one. Carrots, potatoes, thick broth that filled the cabin with warmth. He set out 3 bowls, 2 smaller ones, one for himself, and watched as Theo ate carefully, chewing with quiet dignity, while Nico lapped at his meal with enthusiasm and occasional sneezes. Afterward, the 3 of them sat on the porch. The stars were beginning to appear sharp pricks of light, scattered across a sky so clear it felt holy. The sounds of the forest played softly around them. Crickets, the rustle of a night breeze, the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Ethan leaned back in the old wooden chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Not because he was tired, because he was content. Theo lay on his left side, head resting on his paws, eyes closed but ears alert. Nico curled on the other side, his body pressed close, breathing slow, his bandage now removed fur growing back in soft tufts. Ethan reached down and let his fingers run through both their coats. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is the part no one teaches you to want. Not medals, not noise, just this. Being part of something again." He thought of the article he'd read earlier, one that called them rescued dogs. He didn't like that phrase. It felt incomplete. Because these weren't just animals someone had saved. They were survivors, protectors, symbols of something bigger than a trail or a badge or a news story. They were living proof that love could come back after you'd given up on it. That strength didn't always roar. It sometimes limped toward you in the rain with a leash in its mouth and eyes full of fire. That healing didn't happen in a clinic. It happened in a quiet field when someone chose to stay beside you. That night, just before heading inside, Ethan opened the drawer near the fireplace and pulled out the photograph again. Major. He looked at the shepherd in the picture, the older one with the sharp eyes and the dust-covered vest, and he finally felt the ache shift. Not vanish, but lighten. He whispered the name. Not as a goodbye, but as a continuation. Because now there was a legacy. One Theo and Nico were carrying forward in muddy paw prints and silent strength. He placed the photo back, closed the drawer, and turned toward the boys. Theo had already claimed his spot near the hearth. Nico was half asleep in his usual place under the window. And Ethan? Ethan no longer felt like a man hiding in the woods. He felt like someone who had come home from war and found something waiting for him, not to be fixed, not to be repaired, but to be shared. Something like breath, something like hope. No one gets left behind, he thought. And for the first time in a very long time, he knew that included himself. The metal tag still sat on the cabin windowsill. It caught the morning light like a knife. Ethan had picked it up again that day without meaning to, just passing by the sill fingers, brushing the cool edge of the brass plate and then stopping. Holding it, turning it slowly in his palm. The name engraved on the top was faded, now dulled by weather and time. But the second line, the one that refused to blur, was still sharp and brutal. Only one worth saving. He turned it over again. Back, front, read the words. Let them sit on his tongue like iron. This wasn't just abandonment. This had been something worse. Something crafted. Intentional. A decision carved into metal and left around the neck of a suffering puppy as if it were fact, not violence. Someone out there had tied those two dogs to fate and tried to decide who was allowed to matter. And that morning, Ethan decided he couldn't let it go. Not anymore. He grabbed his ranger bag, clipped his badge to his vest, and whistled once. Theo and Nico looked up from the porch. Theo stood first, then Nico followed. They didn't ask questions. They never did. They just followed. The air was crisp, the trail damp with dew. But Ethan's mind was already burning ahead of his feet. Over the past weeks, fragments had gathered images, signals footage that hadn't meant much on their own. But now, with distance and time, they fit like puzzle pieces dropped in the dark and slowly brought into light. He made his way to the ranger station and walked straight to the back room. The archive wall blinked to life with a low hum as he inserted his clearance card and pulled up drone footage from the week before the rescue. It was just a hunch. Just a moment of instinct. But then he found it. Frame 402. Timestamp 3. 16 p.m., a clearing, 2 puppies, 1 shepherd, 1 husky standing side by side. And a man just behind them. Face obscured by the shadow of a hood, holding a long stick like a cane or a staff. Ethan paused the frame and leaned in. There was a rope in the man's hand. In the next frame, 1 puppy was gone. Only Theo remained. And a small fire pit sat smoking in the distance. Ethan sat back, blood humming. It was him. Whoever this was, he hadn't just dumped the dogs. He'd staged something, watched it, measured it. A test. He checked the camera log again. There were no more frames of the man, but another motion alert had pinged 4 days later in the same zone. Just movement this time. This time leaves shifting trees bending. No body, no face. But Ethan had what he needed. He printed the stills and tucked them into his satchel. And then he went back to where it all began. Back to the place where Theo had first appeared on the side of the road, leash in mouth, eyes full of purpose. He parked the truck by the trailhead and hiked down slowly, deliberately, letting the forest speak. The trees here had long memories. The moss clung to secrets. Even the light seemed reluctant to fall too fast between the branches. Theo moved like a shadow beside him. Nico kept pace a few steps behind, slower but sure-footed. They reached the old fire pit an hour later. It looked undisturbed, just a ring of scorched stones, a few blackened sticks, the scent of ash still faint beneath the soil. Ethan knelt and ran his fingers through the cold remains. Something rough met his touch. He pulled it free. A second tag. Brass, tarnished. But this one didn't say anything cruel. It simply said, Observation Site A. 03. Ethan stared. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some deranged act of neglect. It was a setup. A location marker. Part of something larger. And suddenly the words on Theo's original leash, soaked in gasoline as if meant to burn, took on a more calculated weight. Someone had tried to make a point. Tried to build a narrative. 2 dogs, 1 path, one supposed to survive. But that's not what happened. Theo had turned back, and that had changed everything. Ethan stood slowly, his breath thick in his chest. This wasn't just about justice now. It was about truth. About reclaiming what someone tried to define with cold metal and quiet cruelty. He looked at the 2 dogs standing in the clearing. Nico sat under a crooked branch, eyes steady, calm. The breeze lifted the fur on his chest. His paw, once wrapped, now bore only a faint scar. Theo stood like a sentinel, gaze locked on Ethan, ears tipped slightly back, waiting for direction or maybe permission. Ethan crouched between them and reached out. "You chose each other," he said, voice low. "No one told you who mattered. You decided that together." Theo stepped closer. Nico leaned in, and in the space between their breaths, Ethan realized what he had to do. He would report it, of course. He would follow every procedural step. But this wasn't just going in a file. This was going in a story. Because stories live longer than orders. They reach deeper than reports. And this story needed to be told. Back at the cabin that night, Ethan sat by the fire with a notebook open on the table. He wrote slowly, carefully, like the words needed space to arrive. He wrote about the leash, about the fog, about the silence that followed. But most of all, he wrote about a choice. One that defied expectation. One that broke through a world trying to measure worth with cruelty and instead answered with something far more powerful: loyalty. Theo lay near the hearth, his head tilted up slightly as if listening to every pen stroke. Nico dozed beneath the window, his tail twitching softly in sleep. Ethan paused his writing and looked over at them. And for the first time, he didn't see the two dogs he rescued. He saw two souls who had rescued each other first, and rescued him in the process. The fire crackled gently. The wind whispered outside. And somewhere deep in the night, Ethan thought of the brass tag once more. He got up, retrieved it, and instead of hiding it in a drawer or tossing it in the trash, he placed it on the mantel right beside Major's old harness and the new badges awarded to Theo and Nico. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what they had chosen, of what they refused to believe. Because some people carve judgment into metal, but others carve love into action. And Ethan had seen which one lasts longer. He sat back down at the table and wrote one last line before sleep claimed him. They were never asked who deserved to be saved. They simply decided that no one would be left behind. And just like that, the story began again, this time on their terms. The first snowfall came without warning. Not a storm, just a quiet settling. Like the sky had exhaled gently overnight and blanketed the cabin, the trees, and the world in a silence so complete it could hush even memory. Ethan stepped onto the porch with a mug of hot coffee in his hands, steam curling into the morning air, and took in the white-tipped branches, the thick layer of frost along the railing, and the single trail of paw prints already weaving across the snow. Theo's. The German shepherd had risen early, as always, done his usual patrol around the clearing, and now stood just beyond the porch steps, his gaze cast into the woods like he was waiting for something only he could hear. Nico, on the other hand, had slept in. The husky was still curled in his favorite spot near the fireplace, inside one paw, thrown over his nose, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that could calm oceans. Ethan smiled softly and turned back toward the warmth. Today, he wasn't on call. Today, he wasn't a ranger. He was just a man in a house with two dogs who had changed his life. The cabin glowed golden from the fire, and as he walked in, the wood floor creaked underfoot, familiar, steady like a voice that didn't need to speak to be known. He set the mug down and crossed to the mantel where 3 items sat in careful alignment: an old badge, 2 new ones, and a photo tucked behind them. The old badge was worn smooth around the edges. Major's. The 2 new ones gleamed beneath the firelight. Theo's, Nico's, each etched with their names and the seal of the Redwood Trail Rescue Program. But the photo was the one that held Ethan the longest. Major sitting tall beside him in uniform years ago, in a time that had once felt like a different lifetime. That day, he'd believed he was at the peak of who he could become. He hadn't realized until now that he was still climbing. He reached out and picked up Major's badge, the metal cool in his hand, and set it between the 2 newer ones. Not in mourning, in continuity. As if the story hadn't ended, it had simply passed the torch. from one heartbeat to another, from one loyal soul to two more. Behind him, he heard the soft pad of paws on wood. Theo entered first, snow still dusting his muzzle, his coat slightly damp. He paused in the doorway, gave a small shake, then came to rest by the window, his watchful eyes now settling on Ethan, as if to confirm, yes, the world is safe. Yes, this is home. A moment later, Nico ambled in, tail wagging in half circles, tongue lolling ears, perked with sleep's soft innocence. He plopped down beside Ethan's chair, curling against his boots, like a creature that had never once questioned his belonging. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because that was the thing about this kind of bond, this kind of family. You didn't explain it. You felt it. It was in the quiet walks through fog when no one else was watching. It was in the bark that broke through the cold just in time. It was in the stillness of a winter cabin, when no one asked for anything but presents. He lowered himself into the worn armchair beside the fire, the same chair he'd refused to sit in for years, because it had always felt like too much space for someone who'd chosen solitude. But now, it felt just right, because he wasn't alone. He reached down, scratched behind Theo's ears, then let his hand rest on Nico's back. Both dogs leaned into the contact, no movement wasted, no confusion, just quiet knowing. Outside, the snow continued to fall soft and steady. Inside, the fire popped gently. The world had narrowed down to breath, to warmth, to connection. And Ethan found himself thinking, not for the first time, that maybe this was what healing actually looked like. Not grand epiphanies, not tearful declarations, just a morning with coffee and snow, and the understanding that no one here needed to be anyone else. No performances, no masks, no earning love. Just existing and being enough. He looked back at the mantle one more time. Major, Theo, Nico. 3 stories, 1 message. He closed his eyes briefly, and in the quiet of his mind, he saw them all. Major sprinting across dusty ground, barking into windstorms, holding steady by his side through every battlefield and breakdown. Then Theo standing motionless on a forest path leash, clenched in his jaw, gaze burning with intent. And Nico, half-starved, barely breathing yet, still nudging Ethan's hand with a gentleness that had said, "I'm still here. I'm not done yet." They were never just dogs. They were constants. They were answers. They were rescue in a form few people knew how to see. And Ethan, once lost in the maze of his own guilt and silence, had been found not in therapy or awards or purpose, but in the simplest, quietest act, a choice to believe again. To believe in trust, in second chances, in the miracle of being chosen by something that asks for nothing in return. The fire flickered again. Theo shifted his weight, rising to sit upright, ears perked toward the door. He wasn't alarmed, just aware. Always listening, always steady. Ethan followed his gaze. The snow outside was starting to sparkle. He walked to the front door and opened it slowly. A gust of cold air slipped in, carrying with it the scent of pine and the soft hiss of falling snow. Theo walked to the threshold and sat. Nico padded behind and stood at Ethan's side. Ethan took a deep breath. "This is yours," he whispered. "Not to anyone in particular. All of this. You made this home." The wind didn't answer. It didn't need to. And in that moment, standing there with snow gathering on the porch, firelight glowing behind him, and 2 dogs at his side who had never once asked why, only where to. Next, Ethan finally let the past rest. Not disappear, just rest. The pain of what had been lost would always echo in the corners of his memory. But it no longer controlled the center, because now there was something stronger taking its place. Not closure, but continuation. He turned back inside, left the door slightly ajar, so Theo could keep watch and walked to the mantel again. His fingers brushed over the badges once more, then gently placed a folded note beneath them. It read, "You didn't come to be saved. You came to show me how to live again." And that, more than anything, was the truth. Because in the end, love doesn't always roar or arrive with ceremony. Sometimes it limps out of the woods, half broken, but brave, carrying a leash in its mouth and hope in its eyes. Sometimes it curls up under your feet without needing a reason. Sometimes it just stays and teaches you how to do the same.